Hi there, I'm Abby and this is Abby's Den. Welcome. So I have 3 overlockers to demonstrate seam allowances. Why have I got 3 different ones? The reason is all 3 of them have different ways of identifying your seam allowance. When you buy a commercial pattern, you might download a pattern off the internet. You have allocated on your pattern pieces a seam allowance. Those seam allowances on a commercial pattern allow a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now quite often you'll get patterns that you download PDF style which might be 1.5 centimetre seam allowance and 1 centimetre seam allowance. You've got the measurements on these machines. They are in inches, annoyingly. So you've got to work out how to make it in centimetres for you. Now, I'm old school, so I do like to work with inches. But for those of you who want to work in centimetres, or those of you who want to, allow a little bit more, and you want to work out how much you're going to trim away, let me show you. You might have already sewn a 5/8 seam allowance, and you just want to finish the seam off, or it might be one of my projects and you're quite happy just to serge along. So this is a seam guide. This side is measured in inches and this side is measured in centimetres. So I want to mark my seam allowance 5/8 because I'm using a commercial pattern and they have a seam allowance of 5/8 of an inch. So that's a full inch there. So that's from this line here to there is a full inch, and I want to mark off 5/8. So I'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and just place this slider so it moves along, but it's quite stiff on this one, which is good. So it holds in place there. Now it won't move if I fiddle with it. And what now I can do, can you see that whole of that line there? It sits quite flat against the fabric. So now I can mark my fabric at 5/8 there, and I'll do another one there. And if I grab my ruler, I can join the dots, and I've given myself a 5/8 seam allowance. Okay, there we go. Now, so we can imagine this is a seam line. So I'll do it in dots like that. So that's my seam allowance. So the seam allowance that's the seam, and that space there is the allowance the pattern has given me away from the edge. Now you want to clean that edge up so it doesn't fray. See how this raw edge here has all become frayed? As you wear this garment over time, that's going to fray. So you want to finish the edge off with a clean finish, and an overlocker gives you that option. So we're going to use the seam allowance markings on the overlockers to give us the overlock on the edge. So let's draw it on like this. So it's on the edge there, and the strength of our seam is still there. Now you have 2 needles on your overlocker. And those 2 needles, if you get the tension right, are perfectly fine to act like a seam on your garment or whatever project you're making. If you don't feel confident in that seam allowance, in that seam on your overlocker, then you're quite right to use your sewing machine and sew. And for years and years and years, I used my sewing machine to sew all my seams and then finished it off with the overlocker. As I've become more competent with the overlocker, I'm quite happy to use the overlock. Let's start with the Janome. Now, Janome is a good company for helping you with the markings. Let me show you. On the tabletop here, on the guide door, they have the different markings. The dotted lines and the solid lines represent how far away they are from the needle. Okay, so you've got your left needle and you've got your right needle. This 5/8 marking is how far it is away from that needle, and the solid line is away from the right needle. The reason you need those 2 markings is you might only work with 1 needle. This is set to a 4-thread overlock, and I've set the left needle with a red thread. So I've just sewn my bag, and that's my sewing line. I don't want my overlocking to be along here. That will be no good. I want my overlocking to be at least on this line or inside that line. So if this is accurate, and it hopefully should be because it's brand new out of the box, I should be able to follow that dotted line, put the presser foot down, and I'll sew along. Now the other thing about this machine is there is two markings there. Those two markings will help me guide that line along there. So if I think my placement isn't quite right, if I lift the presser foot and shift that along, you can see I've got the placement right. You can see that edge of the fabric sits alongside that dotted line, and hopefully that red sewing line should now sit either on or just inside that line I've marked at 5/8. Now you've got to remember I'm using this as a tool to measure, and this is measuring as well, so they might not be exactly right. Let's give it a go. And there we go. So you can see my blue line, so that's my sewing machine line, and that red line represents my seam allowance. So the overlocker has trimmed away the fabric that I don't need in the seam allowance and left me with 1/4 inch. So that's 1/4 inch, can you see if I put it to there? And that red line is the left needle, which is sitting just on the inside of that seam. So there you go. So the advantage with having the markings on here is that you don't need to draw the lines. So where I've drawn the lines before, I won't need to draw the lines this time. So if I've cut this fabric out to be a skirt, and I know the seam allowance is 5/8, I can just go ahead and just follow that line, that marking, and know that I've cut away the right amount of fabric to give me my seam finish. So if I've measured that, that will be 5/8 inch from that red line, and it's trimmed off exactly what I don't need. So I didn't need to draw the line on there. Right, so this time let's work on the Brother M343. It's similar again, all the settings and the distances, markings are very similar to all of the Brother machines. So you'll find that's consistent. So let's grab our piece of fabric, and hopefully you can see all these different settings here. So there's one, these two are shorter, but there's one that's actually quite long and goes further down, and that long one there is the 5/8 measurement. So you've got your left and your right markings on there. That 4, I'm not sure what it represents, but I do think it's just the number of the foot. So we're going to place our fabric so it's along that long line, and that's our 5/8. So I'm going to have my fabric lined up with that edge there. So if it sits there, there we go. And the fabric just needs to sit alongside that. And there we go, and there's, I've gone off a little bit there, but that's okay, that's just because of the angle I'm sitting at. But following that line there has given me my red sewing line again on the drawing line. Remember, there's a little bit of a margin of error there. This ruler is slightly off to this, and also it's my drawing and where I held the fabric. Like you can see, I've wavered off there, so I've tapered off there. Shouldn't have done, it's just because I'm sitting at a funny angle. That blue mark that I've created on there, that's where I would have sewn the fabric. My overlocking sits exactly on top of that, bearing in mind that's my 5/8. So if I just place my fabric in there, so there you go. So that's 5/8 of an inch there cut away. And that is 1/4 of an inch. So you always know that a seam allowance left, the amount of fabric left is 1/4 of an inch. So always make sure that you allow at least 1/4 of an inch when you cut fabrics out. So we've got the Serger Lidl, or rather the Serger S1478, which I purchased from Lidl. And we're going to just have a close-up again. Okay, so on close-up, there are no markings on here to identify your seam allowance, and there are no markings on the foot. However, there is this sort of bar that juts up, and if I grab my fabric with the seam allowance marked and lay it along there, what will happen is that is in line with the right needle, with the left needle. Can you see that? Let's see if I do it from that way. So that sits along that side. So as long as I have my fabric slightly away from that line on that side, I should not sew it down. And that will be my seam allowance. So it's a little bit harder. You do, in this case now, have to mark where your seam allowance is. On the other two machines, you may not have had to draw this line. So again, I'm sitting at an angle, but you can see that if I was sat right in front, you can actually get the right and correct seam allowance there. So that seam allowance is marked on, and that's why I was able to make sure that I followed the correct line. So you don't get the markings on the other machines, you do. So you will need to, if you want the seam allowance on this machine, you will need to draw that in. So with the Serger, you will need to mark your edges, unfortunately. Or if you do know that you've allowed 1/4 of an inch seam allowance on, say you've designed your own pattern, like the patterns I've created in the other videos, I've allowed 1/4 of an inch every time. You can trim your fabric, or what you can do is just measure from the needles. It's a bit tricky to do, but you can do it with no markings anywhere. But we've established that this line here will be the sewing line for the needle on the left. So as I lift the presser foot up, I can put a ruler in there, and I know that from there, the centre of that ruler, I can mark whatever distance I want. So if I know the pattern I'm using is going to give me 15mm seam allowance, I can mark that on there, from there to there. Or if I want to use inches and I want to mark 5/8, very, very close, aren't they? 5/8 is 1.5 centimetres. If I want to have it as 1 centimetre there, that's just there. So that will be my 1 centimetre from the needle. And if you don't want to mark on your machine, just grab some masking tape or something and then put the marks on there, and you can just strip the tape off later and try again with another measurement. So I hope that's helped you. I hope you understand a little bit about the markings on your overlocker, or those markings that you can create for yourself. If you like that video and you want to see more like that, let me know. Comment below. Do like the video and do subscribe, and you'll get notified with the other videos I'll be creating. I've got lots more to share with you, lots more information, so that you can help work your overlocker the best for you. Take care.